At first, nothing about the situation seemed unusual. It began the way many public stories do now, with small details that felt easy to ignore: a quiet delay in a scheduled appearance, a sudden change in messaging, a short statement that answered one question but raised several others. On its own, each moment meant very little, but taken together, they suggested that something was shifting behind the scenes. For years, this public figure had been surrounded by attention. Every move was discussed. Every outfit, every partnership, every silence was analyzed. That level of scrutiny had become normal. So when observers noticed that a long-standing professional relationship appeared to cool without explanation, few people reacted at first. Relationships change, brands move on, public interest fades. That is how these stories usually end. But this one did not end there. Instead, the quiet changes continued. Industry figures began to speak more carefully. Media coverage grew cautious, almost restrained. Language that once sounded celebratory became neutral, then distant. There were no dramatic announcements, no formal accusations, no confirmed disputes, just a growing sense that something unresolved was unfolding. What made the situation unusual was not what was being said, but what was not. No clear denials, no detailed explanations, no official timeline. In an industry that thrives on visibility, silence can be meaningful, and silence in this case seemed deliberate. Online discussions started to form, slowly and cautiously. Some focused on business practices. Others questioned how public image is maintained in modern celebrity culture. A few wondered whether long-standing assumptions about access, privilege, and informal arrangements were being reconsidered. None of these discussions offered proof. None claimed certainty. But together, they reflected a broader discomfort. This was not a story driven by shock or outrage. It unfolded quietly, through patterns rather than statements, through absences rather than headlines. And as more people noticed the same gaps, the same unanswered questions, the conversation began to change. This is where the situation became harder to dismiss, not because of what could be confirmed, but because of how many people were now paying attention. And once attention shifts in that way, it rarely returns to where it started. What followed only added to that sense of unease. To understand why the conversation began to shift, it helps to look at the environment that existed long before any questions were raised. This figure had moved through several worlds at once: public service, entertainment, commercial partnerships. Each world operates under different rules, even when they appear to overlap. What is acceptable in one space can be misunderstood in another, especially when boundaries are informal and expectations are rarely written down. In the years following a highly visible transition into private life, the individual at the center of this discussion became closely linked with image-driven industries. Fashion, media production, public speaking, and brand alignment all became part of a broader strategy to maintain relevance. None of this was unusual. Many public figures follow similar paths. The difference here was scale. Attention was constant. Appearances carried symbolic weight. Every choice was interpreted as a signal. Behind the scenes, these industries rely on systems built on trust. Items are provided with the expectation of care. Access is granted with the assumption of discretion. Agreements are often guided by precedent rather than strict contracts. This model works only when everyone involved understands where the limits are. When those limits are unclear, misunderstandings can grow. According to public commentary, some industry professionals began to notice patterns that felt unfamiliar. Items moving quickly through channels, returns processed with unusual frequency, requests handled by intermediaries rather than directly. None of these actions are, on their own, improper, but repetition changes perception, and perception in these industries carries real weight. At the same time, public messaging emphasized independence and professionalism. There was a strong narrative of self-sufficiency, of building something new, of operating within standard commercial norms. That narrative mattered because it framed expectations. Partners assumed conventional processes were being followed. Observers assumed transactions were straightforward. What complicated matters further was the presence of multiple teams. Assistants, stylists, managers, and advisors all played roles. Responsibility became distributed. Decisions were filtered through layers. When questions emerged, it was not always clear who held authority or who had full visibility of the process. As this structure became more complex, accountability became harder to define. Small issues that might have been resolved quietly began to linger, not because they were dramatic, but because no single explanation addressed all of them. And in the absence of clarity, speculation filled the space. This is where the story stopped being about one person alone. It became about how modern celebrity systems function, about how image is maintained, about what happens when informal practices collide with formal expectations. and once those questions entered the conversation, they did not stay contained. At this point, many people started asking questions. As those questions began to circulate, the tone of the discussion shifted again. It moved away from curiosity and toward careful analysis. Commentators were no longer focused on isolated moments. They started looking at sequences, timelines, repeated behaviors that, when viewed together, suggested structure rather than coincidence. Some observers pointed out that public appearances often followed a familiar rhythm. An item would debut briefly, images would circulate, attention would peak, then the item would disappear from view. This pattern is common in promotional cycles, but here it appeared without clear explanation. There were no follow-up partnerships announced, no formal endorsements confirmed. The visibility did not lead anywhere obvious. Others noted how frequently intermediaries were involved. Requests, returns, clarifications, and explanations seemed to pass through assistants rather than being handled directly. Again, this is not unusual at a certain level of prominence, but when questions arise, distance can create friction. It becomes harder to resolve concerns quickly when communication is indirect. Public discussions were careful not to draw conclusions. Many emphasized that no formal statements had been released and no verified claims had been made. Still, the same themes kept resurfacing. Expectations versus reality, informal privilege versus formal agreements, the difference between being seen and being accountable. There was also a broader cultural context at play. In recent years, industries built on exclusivity have become more sensitive to how access is granted and perceived. What was once handled quietly is now scrutinized. Practices that relied on trust are being re-examined. This shift has affected many figures, not just one. As a result, some commentators suggested that the situation might reflect a larger adjustment rather than a personal conflict, a recalibration of boundaries, a reminder that symbolic status does not replace clear terms, that visibility does not equal ownership. These interpretations were framed as discussion, not judgment. What added to the complexity was the lack of closure. No confirmation meant no resolution. Each unanswered question created space for another, and with each new conversation, the focus drifted further from individual actions and toward systemic issues. At this stage, the story was no longer driven by rumors alone. It was sustained by uncertainty, by the sense that something had been paused rather than concluded, and pauses, especially public ones, tend to invite attention. This is where the situation began to change again. As attention increased, so did the effort to look for patterns rather than isolated explanations. This was no longer about a single decision or one misunderstood interaction. People were now examining how often similar situations seemed to appear and whether they followed a recognizable shape. According to public commentary, several industry observers noticed that internal conversations had become more cautious. Requests that were once routine were now handled with extra steps. Documentation became more detailed. Timelines were double-checked. These are small changes, but in professional environments, small changes often signal concern. When trust is steady, processes stay light. When trust is questioned, structure tightens. There were also signs of hesitation that could be felt rather than measured, invitations that never arrived, collaborations that were discussed but not finalized, neutral statements that avoided commitment. None of these confirmed a dispute, but together they suggested restraint. And restraint, when it appears suddenly, rarely comes without reason. Online discussions began to reflect this shift. The tone grew quieter but more focused, fewer bold claims, more careful wording. People were no longer asking what happened, but how situations like this develop at all, how informal arrangements function when visibility is high, how expectations can drift when status is symbolic rather than contractual. Some analysts pointed out that modern celebrity culture often relies on blurred lines. Public figures are treated as partners without clear agreements. Access is granted based on reputation. Benefits are extended based on assumption. This system works until it doesn't. When misunderstandings occur, there is often no clear reference point to resolve them. What stood out in this case was how low. In G, the ambiguity seemed to last. There was no quick correction, no clarifying interview, no document that settled the discussion. Silence continued, even as interest grew. That silence became part of the story, not as evidence but as context. Behind the scenes, institutions are known to respond to uncertainty by protecting themselves first. This can mean internal reviews, policy adjustments, or simply stepping back. None of these actions imply wrongdoing. They reflect risk management, and when risk management becomes visible, people take notice. This was also the moment when comparisons began to appear. not direct accusations, but references to past situations where informal systems failed, where expectations were assumed rather than stated, where public image masked private confusion. These comparisons were framed carefully, emphasizing differences as much as similarities. At the same time, supporters of the public figure argued that the scrutiny itself was unfair. That heightened attention can turn normal processes into suspicious ones, that public figures are often judged by standards that shift without warning. These perspectives added balance to the discussion and prevented it from becoming one-sided. Still, the questions did not disappear. They evolved. Instead of asking who was at fault, people asked why clarity was missing, why boundaries were not clearly communicated, why resolutions seemed delayed. These questions were less dramatic but more persistent. As the conversation matured, it became clear that whatever the underlying issue might be, it had touched a nerve, not because of scandal, but because it highlighted how fragile modern reputations can be, how quickly perception can change when systems rely on assumption rather than agreement. What followed was not an explosion, but a tightening, fewer options, narrower paths forward, and once a situation reaches that stage, even small developments carry weight. This is when public and institutional reactions began to take shape. As the discussion continued to unfold, the response from the public and from institutions followed a familiar but restrained pattern. There were no dramatic statements or sudden reversals. Instead, reactions appeared slowly, often indirectly, and almost always without explanation. Media coverage shifted first. Stories became more careful in tone. Language that once leaned toward praise or speculation turned measured and procedural. Reports focused less on personality and more on process. Words like review, pause, and reassessment began to appear. None of these terms confirmed a problem, but they suggested that attention had moved behind closed doors. Public-facing platforms also adjusted. Appearances became less frequent. Announcements grew shorter. Visual presence, once a key part of the strategy, seemed more selective. Observers noted that this did not look like retreat, but it did look like recalibration. When visibility is reduced without explanation, audiences tend to notice. Institutions, for their part, are rarely reactive in public. Their responses are shaped by policy, not emotion. According to industry analysts, when uncertainty emerges, the first step is often internal alignment. That can mean reviewing past interactions, clarifying expectations, ensuring that future decisions are consistent with updated guidelines. None of this requires public disclosure. This approach can feel frustrating to outside observers. Silence is often interpreted as avoidance, but within large organizations, silence usually signals deliberation. Decisions are rarely made quickly, especially when reputations are involved. The goal is not speed, but containment. Online reaction reflected this tension. Some viewers expressed disappointment, feeling that transparency was owed. Others argued that speculation had gone too far, pointing out that no confirmed issues had been presented. Many took a middle position, acknowledging uncertainty while urging patience. The discussion remained active, but it did not spiral. What was notable was the absence of escalation. No lawsuits announced, no formal complaints confirmed, no direct rebuttals issued. This lack of confrontation kept the story in a suspended state. It neither resolved nor collapsed, it simply continued. Cultural commentators began to frame the situation as an example of a broader shift. In recent years, institutions have become more cautious about informal arrangements, especially those involving public figures. Risk assessments now account for perception as much as performance. Even unverified discussions can influence decisions. From that perspective, the reaction was less about one individual and more about system-wide adjustment. Boundaries that were once flexible are becoming firmer. Access that was once assumed is now reviewed. This does not imply misconduct. It reflects a changing environment. Supporters of the figure emphasized this point. They argued that heightened standards are being applied unevenly, that prominent individuals often become test cases for new rules, that visibility can amplify scrutiny beyond what is reasonable. These arguments resonated with many viewers, especially those familiar with how quickly narratives can form. At the same time, critics pointed out that clarity benefits everyone. Clear agreements prevent misunderstanding. Defined boundaries protect all parties. From this angle, the situation was less about blame and more about lessons that institutions are learning in real time. Media outlets continued to report cautiously. Articles cited sources familiar with the matter without naming them. Phrases like "according to public commentary" and "no formal statement has been released" became standard. This careful framing reflected both legal awareness and editorial restraint. One of the more subtle reactions came from the absence of collaboration. Projects that might have been expected did not materialize. Events passed without participation. These omissions were never explained, but they were noticed. In industries driven by momentum, absence can speak as loudly as presence. Still, there was no sense of finality, no clear break, no closing chapter. The situation remained open-ended, sustained by interest rather than incident. Each week without resolution extended the conversation rather than ending it. This ongoing uncertainty had an unusual effect. Instead of burning out, the story settled into the background. It became part of the larger discussion about how public life functions today, how trust is built, how quickly it can be questioned, how difficult it can be to restore once doubt enters the picture. And that is why the discussion did not fade. It did not rely on new revelations. It relied on unresolved tension, on the gap between what is visible and what is explained, on the feeling that something important was still being worked through, quietly and deliberately. This is why the story continues. As time passed, the lack of resolution became the story itself, not because people were waiting for a dramatic reveal, but because the situation highlighted something deeper about how public narratives now evolve. When clarity is delayed, attention does not disappear. It settles, it watches, it waits. What kept the discussion alive was not outrage, but relevance. Many viewers recognized parts of this situation in other public moments. The slow withdrawal of support, the careful language, the quiet recalibration that happens when institutions decide to pause rather than confront. These patterns feel familiar, even when details differ. Some analysts suggested that this was an example of modern risk management in action. In an environment shaped by constant exposure, institutions move cautiously. They avoid statements that could lock them into a position too early. They prefer flexibility. Silence, in this sense, is not avoidance, it is strategy. For the public figure involved, this created a difficult position. Without a clear issue to respond to, there was nothing to correct. Without a formal claim, there was nothing to deny. Any attempt to address the conversation risked amplifying it. Any silence risked being interpreted as confirmation. It was a narrow path with few good options. Supporters argued that this imbalance was unfair, that individuals are often expected to respond to unverified discussions simply because they exist. That silence is not evidence. That restraint should not be mistaken for guilt. These arguments were repeated often, and they found an audience. At the same time, others noted that prolonged ambiguity carries its own consequences. Partnerships rely on confidence. Confidence relies on clarity. When clarity is missing, even temporarily, decisions are delayed. Opportunities move elsewhere. Momentum slows. This tension between fairness and caution is at the heart of why the story continues. It is not driven by new information, but by unresolved dynamics, by systems adjusting in real time, by reputations navigating environments where perception can change faster than facts. The situation also raised broader questions about how public figures manage transitions. Moving between roles, industries, and expectations requires careful alignment. When that alignment slips, even slightly, friction appears, not as scandal, but as hesitation. Over time, the conversation became less personal and more structural, less about what one person did or did not do, and more about how modern public life operates, how visibility creates assumptions, how assumptions create risk, how risk reshapes behavior. Media outlets reflected this shift. Coverage became analytical rather than speculative. Stories focused on trends, on industry norms, on how similar situations have unfolded in the past. The individual case became an example rather than the focus. This framing allowed the discussion to persist without escalating. It kept the tone serious and restrained. It acknowledged uncertainty without demanding resolution, and in doing so, it extended the life of the story. What remains clear is that this is not a moment defined by a single event. It is defined by its duration, by the way it has unfolded slowly, without clear markers, by how it has invited reflection rather than reaction. As the months continue, the situation may eventually resolve quietly, or it may simply fade as attention moves on, but the questions it raised will linger, about clarity, about boundaries, about how public figures and institutions navigate trust in an age where everything is visible, but not everything is explained. This brings us to the final reflection. When looking back at how this situation unfolded, what stands out most is not what can be proven or disproven, but how carefully everything moved. There were no sharp turns, no sudden confrontations, just a slow adjustment, carried out in public view but without public detail. This kind of ending, if it can even be called an ending, feels increasingly common. Stories no longer resolve with statements or clear conclusions. They drift into quieter forms, shaped by absence rather than announcement. And for audiences, that can feel unsettling, even when nothing dramatic has occurred. It also reveals how fragile modern reputations have become, not because people are less resilient, but because systems are more interconnected. One pause can affect many paths. One unanswered question can influence multiple decisions. In that environment, clarity becomes valuable, but also difficult to provide. For the individual at the center of this discussion, the future remains open. There is no confirmed outcome to point to, no formal judgment to reference, only a changed landscape, one where access may be more structured, where assumptions are less generous, where every move is measured more carefully than before. For institutions, the situation serves as a reminder. Informal arrangements work only as long as trust is shared. When visibility increases, so must clarity. Policies evolve not in response to scandal, but to risk, and risk does not require wrongdoing to exist. For the public, this story offered something quieter than outrage. It offered a glimpse into how power, image, and caution interact behind the scenes, how silence can carry meaning without providing answers, how attention can linger without escalation. This is why the discussion has stayed alive, not because it demands resolution, but because it reflects a moment of transition, a shift in how public life is managed, a reminder that visibility does not guarantee understanding. As attention eventually moves elsewhere, this story will likely be remembered not for what happened, but for how it unfolded, slowly, carefully, without confirmation or denial. It will stand as an example of how modern narratives evolve when certainty is absent. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion available, not a verdict but an observation, that in today's public world, stories do not always end. Some simply change shape, and in doing so, leave behind questions that continue to matter.